Okay. Now, what about religious reforms? I think there's a lot of debates right now that talk about, is religion actually becoming more progressive right now? So I would note that religions do evolve, they do change, right? Like it's not as if what they were previous, like centuries ago, is still the same right now. Religions evolve, but they do evolve quite slowly, and there are two influences within that evolution. The first is that these are external factors. So these are things that are outside of that religion, and being that are able to like influence the way that religion change. What does this look like? I think it looks like things such as nationalism, right? Nationalism can definitely change the way that religion and as well as religious scriptures are being reinterpreted. Is society becoming more progressive is also another one. So there could also be an interaction with the dominant ideologies of a nation, um, and as well as the religion that exists inside that country. But it's also sometimes about internal change. So sometimes there are people inside that religion that tries to change how certain religion operates. And the only thing here is that it's about collective action as well. So if a lot of people believe that there are some practices that ought, for example, to change, then it can happen. For most of the time, though, there's a problem with collective action as well, because there are some individuals, I would note, that are quite devoted towards these forms of scriptures, and therefore there's less justification or motivation for them to participate between this collective action. But it can still be slow, and the reason why it can be slow is uniquely because religion is very hierarchical, right? The person at the top of the hierarchy is often believed to have like theological access and very good spiritual access towards God's will and God's like plans or something, and therefore you don't really have any incentive to question these people. And for people who wants to advance this hierarchy, there's just a massive pressure to never question these established norms, because like we suggest, some individuals are just quite devoted to it, but it's also just that for the person who have consumed this a lot, it is often seen as like quite bad to do it. Like it feels sinful to do it, right? At the same time, the position in this hierarchy is also just never elected democratically, but it's appointed by someone higher. Therefore, it incentivizes people, especially those that are vying for leadership, to basically like suck up to the person so that you can also advance. And therefore, the incentives of things such as prestige, security, and pleasing God, for example, makes it quite slow because there's just a lot of things that are reinforcing to it. But quite lastly, it's also just that you cannot challenge the word of God. And this is also strengthened by the person that is residing on the top of the hierarchy, right? It's really hard, for example, to reinterpret these different scriptures, and often takes a very, very long time because it needs to undergo a process of, well, you challenging the person on the top that has access to that will, but also the codified scriptures that already exists and has been consumed for quite a long time. But it did like change, right? Like a good example of the change that we can see in religion is the ordination of women within Catholicism. This happens, I don't know, like 1900s or something like that. But this was motivated by a grassroots movement called the Ordination of Women. When this took place, there was a massive backlash with people from that religion. Like, of course, they didn't like it, right? And what happened is a lot of churches broke away from that religion, and then the evangelicals increasingly became a bit more radically conservative when they allowed the movement, for example, to do the change, right? So religious reforms, even when it happens, is not going to be effective in changing the norms within that religion, in the sense that it is quite difficult to change its norms, especially when it's relatively new in comparison to something that has been embedded with them for so long, and especially as well as it is from grassroots movements and not inside that religion. And of course, you also create the radicalness that harms these individuals. But of course, it's just like one example out of the many other examples that exist in the world in terms of how these religions have changed. Now, apart from religions changing, I also just want to talk about the decline of religiosity. And I think the reason why this is included in this particular lecture is just that in a lot of sense, there are ways right now that people interact less with religion. So the reasons for this is just that As societies modernize, religions loses influence over things like politics, education, law, and even the daily life. The creation of education means that scientific reasoning and technology provide alternative explanations for the world that were previously answered by religion. So a lot of the institutions that we have right now, like schools, like hospitals, and governments, took over the role that was once led by governments. So religion right now perhaps is declining because there is a shift from a public authority to a more private personal choice that individuals right now can have. So, what are the different parts of this decline of religiosity? Because right now it sounds simple, but quietly it's not, but like it's not that simple. Okay, whatever. So the first one is just about the loss of faith or the decline in belief. This can be a lot of there's this can be associated to a lot of things. So it could be the case that there is just increased access to education, which is the reason why it encourages things like critical thinking and questioning of very old and traditional doctrines. Perhaps it is the case of globalization, where people were exposed to more diverse worldviews that makes exclusive religious claims feel less certain and less true. Maybe it's also just about scandals involving religious leaders or the perceived hypocrisy, for example, that people feel are inside religion. And that's why there is a reduction of trust within these institutions. Maybe it's about how the younger generation see it as outdated and incredibly traditional, or perhaps it is the fact that people just become less likely to inherit that belief from their family or community because the family themselves are participant, for example, of a greater society, like they have jobs and therefore they're unlikely, for example, to influence or convert their children. So, but it's also just the loss of purpose, right? I think it's that religion right now just has reduced social functions because of secularization. So, religion historically gave meaning to suffering. It gave us explanations for death. It gives us guidance for things like morality and even our ability to belong in a community. But modern alternatives now fill in a lot of these roles. You have psychology or therapy for emotional support. You have social media for and communities for belonging. You have philosophy for meaning and state welfare, for example, for charity and support. So because religion no longer becomes the main provider for a lot of the things that they historically provided, the dependence on it also declines. So it is also just a case that I think there's a rise in things like consumer culture and individualism that replace collective spiritual identity with more such as personal achievement or material success. And it's just a case that I think right now people increasingly seek meaning through other things like their careers or maybe how they belong in the nation. And I think quite lastly, it's just that it's about how institutionally religion also became a bit more complacent when they were dominant. So in places where religion often dominated and faced little challenge, often these institutions increasingly became more rigid and leaders often feel less pressure to adapt, change, and in fact understand what the real scenarios of the lived experiences of this individual who go to their church look like. So the services that they have, the teachings they become less responsive to the followers because previously they were, dominantly because they were the dominant religious belief within that area. So without competition from other religious groups or alternative institutions like the government, these kinds of engagement weakened, and therefore a lot of people have disengaged. And perhaps that is one of the reasons why the decline, or a few of the reasons why the decline of religiosity existed. Now, another part of this lecture is very, very shortly about folk religiosity. And the reason why I think this is quite nice to talk about is just that in the Philippines, there's a lot of motions about folk religiosity. And I think it's such a nice thing to evaluate. I think it's quite new. I don't know if it's new, but I think it's quite unique. And the first time that I encountered this particular motion, so this was, sorry, folk religiosity is one of the themes that I have encountered as a new debater back in 2021. And I didn't know what it was. So I was like, okay, at least it's such a fun thing to learn, but also like teach about as well. Yeah. So in order for you to understand, the Philippines is a highly religious country, right? Like there's a lot of different religions in the Philippines. You have Roman Catholics, you have Islam, you have Iglesia Ni Cristo and other things like Jehovah and the Bible Baptist and stuff like that. But folk religiosity is not about the existence of numerous religions. But folk religiosity is the reinterpretation of official religions at the community level or popular level, and they mix the official religion with local customs, beliefs, and practices that you have. So, what does this look like in the Philippines? Before the Spanish colonization, the Filipinos actually practice animism. So they believe a lot in things such as spirits, nature, local shamans and priests. You had local religious leaders like the Babaylan and shamans who guided different rituals. There's also the influence of other religions like Hindu, Buddhism, and Islam that were also present in the different parts of the archipelago before colonialism. When Spain colonized the Philippines, they brought in Catholicism and they really spread it quite well. So they built up churches and sacraments, and Catholic teachings just became incredibly widespread. And the thing is that when they were doing this, there was a degree that they were forcing people to change their beliefs. So it was done through violence and coercion and different colonial pressure so that people would stop, for example, their previous or their pre-colonial beliefs. So happened was the Filipinos adopted Catholicism rather than replacing their old beliefs. So it was a bit unsuccessful for the Spanish because it wasn't that they completely erased all forms of pre-colonial beliefs, but they merged it, right? And one of the merges that came here is that the local shamans during the time of colonialism continued these traditions underground. You had religious fraternities that emerged that also were created as a response to Spanish oppression. Like you have the examples of Hermano Pule, for example, that showed why the religion that was created in the merging or in this folk in the merging of the Spain import, as well as what was happening in the pre-colonial belief, became a symbol of identity and resistance that was merged during this very turbulent times. And because of that, folk religiosity are still things that are existing right now. So until now, there's a lot of people that conflate the meaning of healing as well as prayer, of things such as having a shaman during terms of having a shaman, for example, in very important religious festivities, or even them having pilgrimage, for example, in very important religious sites like Mount Banahaw. So that's just, I think, quite a nice thing for you guys to learn in terms of folk religiosity and the nuance it has in the Philippines. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. Hope to see you guys in Hanoi pretty soon.